At the Hands of Persons Unknown, The Lynching of Black America was written by Philip Dray and published in 2003. According to Dray, lynching was used to keep African Americans in a perpetual state of fear for their lives, avoiding black progress, and allowing whites to maintain their power. His purpose in writing the book was to show the destructive power of lynching on all blacks and the effects of years of lynching even in the present. He says, is it possible for white America to really understand blacks' distrust of the legal system, their fears of racial profiling in the police, without understanding how cheap a black life was for so long a time in our nation's history? Dray follows the history of lynching in a mostly chronological format, tracing lynching in the United States from its pre-Civil War roots to its post-Reconstruction focus on maintaining the racial status quo to the Civil Rights Movement and the first successful prosecution of white lynchers. Along the way, he highlights people and groups who attempted to end lynching and gives graphic examples of the mob murders of African Americans. The United States has a long history of vigilante justice. The frontier nature of early America made the legal system unwieldy and encouraged vigilante justice. In the beginning, more whites than blacks were lynched, but after Reconstruction, lynching became not only a civilian justice system, but also a way to reinforce the existing caste system. And by 1900, lynching almost exclusively referred to the summary execution of Southern black men. Lynching could be the result of any crime. Some examples of crimes leading to lynching were window peeping, making moonshine, and being troublesome. However, the most common reason for a black man to be lynched was accusations of sexually assaulting a white woman. Black men were seen as having little to no control over their sexual desires and were assumed to be likely to rape white women if given the opportunity. Rape of a white woman was almost always included on the list of charges against a man who was going to be or had been lynched. Ida B. Wells was one of the first to research the true causes of lynching. Starting in the 1880s, Wells studied articles about lynchings from both black and white-owned newspapers and, when possible, visited towns where the events had occurred. Her research showed that the rape charges that were used to justify lynch mobs were often false. Sometimes they were the result of consensual relationships between black men and white women. It was considered impossible for a white woman to willingly have sex with a black man, therefore it must be rape even if the woman acknowledged the relationship. Sometimes rape charges were simply added to the list of crimes to stir up hysteria and a willingness to murder. If a black man offended a white person in any way, charges of rape or even disrespect to a white woman could lead to lynching. After Reconstruction, as Jim Crow laws solidified racial segregation in the South, spectacle lynchings were another way to emphasize the separation between blacks and whites. These lynchings were big productions, often planned in advance to give spectators from nearby towns time to arrive by car or train. The victim was publicly tortured and usually immolated. Souvenirs were taken from the body and postcards were made with pictures taken at the scene. Dray begins his book with a description of the spectacle lynching of Sam Hose in 1899. Hose was accused of murdering his employer and raping his employer's wife. Once Hose was captured, his ears, fingers, and genitals were cut off, and he was covered in kerosene and set on fire. So many people wanted to watch the torture and death of Hose that 2 extra train cars were sent from Atlanta just for hopeful spectators. W.E.B. Du Bois credits his research into Hose's lynching with helping him understand that lynching was not the action of a few barbaric whites, but was fully ingrained in white society. Progressive era groups such as the National Association of Colored Women and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as well as the Black Press, made the end of lynching a priority of their organizations, but they were fighting against a federal government that was indifferent at best. The anti-lynching movement had a few successes. For example, after Wells pressured the governor of Illinois to follow state law and fire a sheriff who allowed a lynching to take place, a half a year later, another sheriff in Illinois had his men open fire on and disperse a mob to avoid losing his job. Wells had proven that anti-lynching laws could encourage law enforcement officers to protect their charges. Returning World War I veterans faced increasing threats, as whites did not like seeing blacks in military uniforms, and black men who had fought a war to make the world safe for democracy were less willing to be deferent to whites than they were before the war. Also, the increased movement of blacks to the north increased racial violence in that region. In Central Park in 1911, Booker T. Washington, the most influential African American at the turn of the century, was attacked and beaten by a group of white men for allegedly making a flirtatious comment to a white woman. In Detroit in 1925, mobs used violence as they tried, and sometimes succeeded, to force successful doctors out of their homes in white neighborhoods. Overall, the number of lynchings declined during the 1920s, leading to some to believe the barbarity was running its course and would soon be obsolete. However, the economic struggles during the Great Depression led to an increase in lynchings. Even in well-publicized cases with actual trials, black men could not expect to be treated fairly, as was seen in the case of the Scottsboro Boys in 1931. Civil rights groups never successfully got federal anti-lynching passed by Congress. However, the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust made the treatment of blacks in America an embarrassment to the nation, and slowly, the government began working to help African Americans rather than working against them. While it is not the last instance of violence against African Americans, Dre considers the endpoint of the lynching era to be the murders of 3 voter registration workers in Mississippi in 1964. This is the last time a mob acted in concert with the police, and it was the first time a lynching case ended with convictions and prison sentences for the murderers. For many years, the best scholarly work on lynching was The Tragedy of Lynching by Arthur Raper, published in 1933. Since the mid-1970s, however, both historical writing and interest in lynching has exploded, even including a New York exhibition of lynching photographs in 2000. Dre's purpose was to explain how lynching has affected African Americans. The major criticism of the book is related to that purpose. While Dre mentions 3 lynchings of white Americans that specifically affected the efforts to end the lynching of black Americans, he never mentions the thousands of Mexican Americans who were lynched during the same period. However, At the Hands of Persons Unknown does give a comprehensive account of the lynching of blacks in the United States. The graphic detail of the many lynchings Dre describes, while difficult to read at times, help the reader see how horrific the murders were and better understand the level of fear among people in the black community.